Welcome back to Lore at Night, where rain gently falls and every story carries a shadow. I'm always curious to hear where in the world you're listening from, so comment that down below. Now get comfortable, and let's begin with the first story. Every window in the house glowed against the rain, bright and wrong at 2 in the morning, the kind of detail that pulled attention without announcing why. The neighbors noticed it only after the police cars arrived, blue and red washing over manicured lawns and mailbox flags, turning a quiet cul-de-sac into a place that would never feel ordinary again. The body was in the garage. Evan Holt lay on his back beneath the open hood of his sedan, arms extended upward as if frozen mid-repair. His chest was caved inward, ribs collapsed unevenly, the damage consistent with repeated blows delivered from above. Blood streaked the concrete in long arcs, dragged by movement rather than sprayed. A hydraulic jack lay tipped over nearby, its metal handle bent slightly near the grip. This had not been an accident. The garage door was open. The house itself was immaculate, shoes aligned by the entryway. Counters wiped clean. A television paused mid-program, remote placed carefully on the coffee table. Nothing appeared disturbed until the basement door. It was locked from the outside. Detective Miles Kerr arrived while the rain was still falling steadily, soaking into the concrete and flattening the evidence at the edges. He stood in the garage for a long moment before moving, reading the violence the way he had learned to read storms. The pattern was intimate, controlled, and prolonged. Holt had been alive for much of it. The angle of the blows suggested someone who stood close, adjusted position, and continued. Kerr followed the trail down. The basement steps were clean until the last 3. There, faint smears marked where something heavy had been dragged upward and then stopped. At the bottom of the stairs, the basement opened into a workshop. It was orderly in the way obsessions often were. Tools hung in precise rows. Labels were printed, not handwritten. The workbench was scrubbed to a dull shine. On the wall above it, a calendar displayed the month, with several dates circled in thick red ink. Each circled date had a name written beside it. Some were crossed out. Evan Holt's name was circled and crossed through. The freezer in the corner hummed quietly. Kerr did not open it yet. He already understood the shape of what he was standing inside. The basement was not a dumping ground. It was a preparation space. The lock on the door told him this place was meant to keep people in, not out. Upstairs, Holt's phone lay on the kitchen counter, powered on, the screen cracked but functional. The last photo taken showed a man Kerr did not recognize standing in the basement workshop, smiling broadly, eyes wide, face flushed with exertion. The photo was taken at close range, angled upward, as if the photographer had been kneeling. The timestamp was 11 minutes before Holt's estimated time of death. Kerr felt the case settle into something heavier than procedure. This was not rage or panic or escalation. This was ritual. The medical examiner confirmed what the scene already suggested. Holt's injuries occurred over a span of time. Early trauma to the legs impaired movement. Later trauma to the chest and shoulders forced compliance. The fatal blows came only after exhaustion set in. There were no defensive wounds beyond the first minutes. After that, Holt's body had stopped responding. Neighbors described Holt as quiet, methodical, polite. He worked in quality assurance for a manufacturing firm. He fixed his own car. He waved when spoken to and retreated quickly afterward. No arguments, no disputes, no history of violence. The man in the photograph was identified within hours. His name was Caleb Rowan. Rowan lived 3 streets over, in a rented split-level house with a detached garage, and no close friends. He had been reported for noise complaints before, mostly late-night mechanical sounds. the line of tools used too long after midnight. He worked nights as a sanitation technician, cleaning industrial facilities after hours. His record showed trespassing charges and a single assault that never went to trial. When officers arrived at Rowan's house, the door was unlocked. Inside, the walls were bare. Furniture was sparse and positioned carefully away from corners, as if to allow movement. In the detached garage, officers found another workshop, larger and less refined than Holt's. The floor was stained despite repeated scrubbing. A digital camera sat on a tripod, facing a marked section of concrete. The camera's memory card was full. Kerr watched the footage alone later that morning. He did not need sound to understand what he was seeing. The video showed men bound, positioned, and struck methodically. There was no frenzy, no hesitation. The camera never moved once recording began. In the final video, Holt looked directly into the lens, breathing hard, eyes unfocused. Behind the camera, someone adjusted the frame, steadying it with care. Caleb Rowan stepped briefly into view to check the angle. He was smiling. The footage ended seconds later, not with violence, but with the calm click of a hand reaching forward to stop the recording. Kerr closed the file and leaned back in his chair as the rain finally tapered off outside. This was not a killer driven by grievance or revenge or desperation. This was a man who needed witnesses, even if only through glass and memory. And the calendar on Holt's wall suggested he was not finished yet. Caleb Rowan did not flee. That fact unsettled Detective Miles Kerr more than any of the footage. Rowan's house showed no signs of hurried departure. The bed was made. The sink was dry. Work boots sat by the door, laces loosened evenly, toes aligned. In the refrigerator, food was portioned and labeled by day. A calendar on the kitchen wall mirrored the one in Evan Holt's basement. Same thick red circles, same neat block lettering. Different names. Some were crossed out. Kerr studied the dates. They followed a cadence, not weekly or monthly, but irregular in a way that suggested mood rather than schedule. The intervals shortened over time. The gaps between names narrowed, as if restraint had become inefficient. In Rowan's garage, technicians cataloged the tools. None were exotic. Wrenches, clamps, a rubber mallet worn smooth at the handle, a length of steel pipe cut to size and taped at one end for grip. The camera tripod stood exactly 12 feet from the marked section of floor, its legs measured and leveled with care. Chalk lines showed where subjects were placed. Foot positions, knees, head angle. This was choreography. The videos revealed more than violence. They revealed rehearsal. In several clips, Rowan adjusted lighting before bringing anyone into frame. He checked focus. He stepped back and looked at the space as if assessing a stage. When the subject struggled, he did not react. He waited until they exhausted themselves. When they went still too early, he revived them briefly, not with kindness, but with necessity. Kerr forced himself to watch the footage all the way through. He noted how Rowan spoke, though the sound was faint and often drowned by breathing and impact. The tone was conversational, almost instructional. He explained what was happening as it happened, not to calm, but to fix memory. He wanted his subjects to know where they were in the process. The list of victims grew as the review continued. Some faces were identified quickly, pulled from missing persons reports that had been filed months apart and never connected. Others were harder to place. Men who lived alone. Men who moved often. Men whose absence did not create immediate noise. Rowan chose carefully. He selected people who could be isolated without explanation, then erased without urgency. There was no financial motive, No sexual component visible in the footage. The violence was not symbolic in the way ritual killings often were. It was operational. Rowan did not collect trophies beyond recordings. He did not revisit scenes. He did not insert himself into investigations. He worked, then reset. The question that formed slowly in Kerr's mind was not why Rowan killed, but why he stopped between kills. What held him back long enough for gaps to exist at all? The answer came from Holt's phone. Messages recovered from the device showed a brief exchange between Holt and Rowan 2 days before the murder. They did not know each other well. Holt had responded to a post on a local forum about basement ventilation, offering advice. Rowan thanked him and asked to see Holt's setup in person. Holt agreed. There was nothing unusual in the tone, no alarm, just practical discussion between two men who liked order. Kerr realized then that Holt's basement was not incidental. It was aspirational. Rowan had seen something there that he wanted. The lock, the cleanliness, the control of space. Holt had unknowingly built a better room for what Rowan already did. Holt had not been chosen because he was weak. He had been chosen because he was precise. The calendar in Holt's basement had not been made by Holt. The ink matched Rowan's. The handwriting was identical. Rowan had marked the space as his own before the killing, before the first blow landed. Officers expanded the search radius quietly, checking storage units, short-term rentals, and closed commercial spaces Rowan could have accessed through his night job. They found 2 more rooms, both cleaned, both staged, both empty except for chalk marks and faint blood in drains. Rowan was building redundancy. By the end of the second day, Kerr felt the investigation pulling against time. The crossed-out names meant completed acts. The uncrossed ones meant intent. The narrowing gaps meant acceleration. Rowan had not run because he did not need to. He had prepared places where waiting felt productive. Somewhere nearby, another room was already ready. The break came from a place no one wanted to look too closely at. Caleb Rowan's job put him inside buildings after everyone else had left. Factories, office parks, medical complexes, closed schools. Places that trusted invisibility to do the work of security. Detective Miles Kerr requested Rowan's work logs, expecting little more than confirmation of access. What he found instead was rhythm. Rowan favored older buildings with basements that had been renovated just enough to function and forgotten just enough to be ignored. His roots lingered near properties scheduled for demolition or long-term vacancy. He returned to some locations repeatedly, even when his assignment did not require it. He clocked out on time, but his truck often stayed parked nearby for another hour, waiting, not working. Kerr overlaid the work logs with the calendar dates. The alignment was exact enough to be chilling. On days names were circled, Rowan had been assigned to facilities within a 3-mile radius of the listed address. On days names were crossed out, he had been off shift by the time police were called. He was not hiding, he was sequencing. The uncrossed names narrowed the search. 3 remained. All lived alone. All had posted recently on forums or community boards about home repairs, ventilation, or workshop setup. All had basements. Kerr assembled a quiet detail. No press. No sirens. They knocked doors under the pretense of safety inspections and utility checks, careful not to create a pattern Rowan could feel before he saw it. At the first address, the man answered the door confused but unharmed. His basement was unfinished, cluttered, unusable. Kerr crossed the name off the board himself. At the second, no one answered. Inside, officers found a basement too clean for its age. Fresh paint. A new lock on the interior door. Chalk residue near a floor drain. Hastily scrubbed but still visible under the right light. Rowan had been there. The third address was a duplex near the edge of town. The tenant was a middle-aged man who worked from home, friendly to a fault, eager to talk about airflow and moisture control. Kerr listened with half an ear while watching the man's eyes drift repeatedly toward the hallway. When asked about the basement, the man hesitated, then said he did not use it much. Kerr asked if they could take a look anyway. The man agreed too quickly. The basement was unfinished but prepared. Hooks mounted into joists. A portable work light positioned precisely. The air smelled faintly of bleach, and something metallic beneath it. There were no chalk lines yet. Rowan was not done setting the stage. Kerr pulled his team back and widened the net. Traffic cameras were checked for Rowan's sanitation truck. It appeared twice that night, idling near the duplex, engine running, lights off. It did not approach the house. It did not leave the area. Rowan was nearby. At dawn, a patrol officer spotted the truck parked behind a closed recreation center less than a mile away. The engine was warm. The cab was empty. The back doors were locked. Kerr arrived as the sun crested low and pale over the buildings. He stood behind the truck and felt the familiar tightening in his chest, the sense that whatever waited on the other side of those doors had been arranged carefully, not for escape, but for continuation. Inside the cargo area, the space had been cleared of equipment. The floor was scrubbed clean, then marked with faint tape outlines that suggested position rather than restraint. A camera was mounted to a beam, already leveled. The battery indicator glowed green. Rowan had adapted. This was not a fixed location killer anymore. This was a mobile one, refining his process as attention grew. He no longer needed basements. He needed privacy for minutes at a time. Kerr closed the doors and ordered the area secured. Roadblocks went up quietly. Officers fanned outward on foot, checking alleys, stairwells, service corridors. They moved slowly, deliberately, knowing speed created noise. They did not find him. What they found instead was a message. On the workbench in Holt's basement, beneath the calendar, someone had placed a new photograph overnight. It showed the duplex basement, empty, well lit, perfectly framed. On the back, in Rowan's neat block lettering, a single sentence had been written. Almost. Kerr stared at the photo until the meaning settled in fully. Rowan had been watching the response. He had learned what proximity felt like. He had adjusted accordingly. The calendar no longer mattered. The rooms did. And somewhere nearby, Caleb Rowan was already building the next one. Patient and smiling, with no intention of stopping simply because someone was finally looking. Caleb Rowan was found where he had always been most comfortable, not running, not hiding, working. The call came just after midnight from a facility supervisor at an aging medical complex scheduled for partial demolition. A night cleaner reported lights on in a sub-basement that had been sealed for months. The cleaner did not investigate. He recognized the wrongness of light in a place designed to be forgotten. Detective Miles Kerr arrived with a small team and no sirens. The sub-basement smelled of disinfectant layered over something metallic. Temporary lighting had been installed in clean lines. Extension cords were taped down. A camera sat mounted at shoulder height, already focused on an empty square of concrete. Rowan was adjusting the frame. He did not react when officers entered the space. He finished aligning the tripod, stepped back to check symmetry, then turned as if acknowledging an expected audience. His hands were clean. His clothes were clean. His expression was focused, mildly pleased. The arrest was unremarkable. Rowan offered no resistance. He allowed the cuffs to be placed without comment, then glanced once more at the camera as if committing the image to memory. Kerr noticed that Rowan's breathing slowed once his hands were secured. Containment. not capture, appeared to relax him. The search that followed filled in what had been missing. Rowan had maintained a rotating set of prepared spaces across the city, none permanent, all precise. He used his access to test acoustics, sightlines, and exit timing. He selected victims who responded to practical requests, people who valued order and believed courtesy signaled safety. He documented everything, not to revisit later, but to confirm completion. The recordings were proof that the process worked. Psychological evaluation came back quickly and without ambiguity. Rowan did not experience remorse or compulsion in the way the word was commonly used. He experienced calibration. When something felt misaligned, he corrected it. People were components. Rooms were variables. The act was not release. It was resolution. Kerr reviewed the calendar one last time before it was logged into evidence. The crossed-out names stopped with Evan Holt. The uncrossed ones had been replaced by locations. Addresses without people attached. The shift mattered. Rowan had moved past individuals. He had begun optimizing environments. The indictment was extensive. The trial was not. Rowan waived it. In his final statement to the court, he did not describe violence. He described errors. He spoke about noise, about inefficiency, about how panic ruined form. He acknowledged the deaths as outcomes, not actions, and expressed mild disappointment that interruption had occurred before the last space reached readiness. The sentence removed him permanently. Afterward, Kerr returned to the cul-de-sac where it began. Holt's house was dark now, the garage empty, the basement sealed. New owners would come eventually. They would repaint. They would replace locks. They would not feel the pressure in the walls. The sanitation truck was decommissioned. The sub-basement was filled with concrete. The city moved on, confident that the right person had been caged. Kerr knew better. Rowan had not been chasing chaos. He had been chasing quiet control, the kind that left no trace until it was complete. The danger had not been his rage or his cruelty. It had been his patience, his willingness to wait until everything felt correct. The investigation closed with checklists satisfied and spaces neutralized. It did not close the understanding that some people did not want escape, attention, or recognition. They wanted a room, and time enough to finish arranging it. Now, let's start another story for tonight. The trailer shook when the second blow landed. Not rattled, but shifted. The thin aluminum skin flexing inward with a sound that carried across the dirt lot and died quickly in the open desert air. The porch light stayed on. Whoever lived there had not bothered to turn it off, or had not been given the chance. The body was found outside, face down in the gravel. Marcus Doyle lay just beyond the edge of the porch, one arm tucked beneath his chest, the other stretched forward as if he had tried to crawl back toward the door. His head was split along the crown, the wound deep and irregular, opened by something heavy and blunt. Blood soaked the gravel beneath him, dark and clotted where it had pooled, thinner where it had been dragged. A cinder block lay a few feet away, chipped at one corner, its surface slick. This had not been quick. Deputy Carla Nguyen arrived first, her headlights cutting across the lot and illuminating the small crowd that had already gathered at a distance. Trailer parks bred witnesses, but not interveners. People knew when to stay inside. Nguyen approached slowly, eyes tracking the scene before her feet did. The blood pattern told her Marcus Doyle had been struck inside the trailer first, then forced out. There were scuff marks on the porch steps, smears along the railing, where someone had gripped and lost strength. The front door was open. Inside, the trailer was wrecked with intent. Not random destruction, but targeted violence. A folding table had been overturned and smashed. A chair was broken cleanly in half. The television was face down on the floor. The screen shattered inward as if struck deliberately. Blood marked the narrow hallway in thick streaks, leading from the back bedroom toward the door. Marcus Doyle had been awake for most of it. The medical examiner would later confirm that. Multiple impacts, different angles, early injuries that crippled movement, later ones that punished it. The fatal blow came near the end, delivered after Doyle was already struggling to breathe. Nguyen noticed something else immediately. Doyle's hands were bound behind his back with electrical cord, twisted tight enough to bite into the skin. The cord had been cut cleanly, not torn, the ends tucked beneath his wrists, as if whoever freed him had done so carefully. Someone had let him try to escape. Marcus Doyle was 38 years old. He had lived in the trailer for less than 6 months, paid rent in cash, kept irregular hours. His record showed assault charges, none recent enough to matter legally. He worked odd jobs, mostly night labor, loading docks and warehouse cleanup. People described him as volatile, quick to anger, quicker to disappear when trouble followed. But this was not trouble following him. This was trouble arriving. Detective Jonah Reyes arrived just after midnight. He stood in the doorway of the trailer and took in the violence without expression, letting the scene settle into sequence. The bindings told him control came first. The destruction told him someone wanted Doyle disoriented, stripped of comfort and leverage. The decision to cut the cord told him the end was meant to be experienced upright, conscious, and aware. Reyes walked the perimeter of the lot. Tire tracks led in and out cleanly. One vehicle, likely a pickup, parked close enough to the porch to block the view from the road. No skid marks. No rush. A neighbor finally spoke when prompted. She heard voices earlier, raised but not shouting. One voice was Doyle's. The other was unfamiliar, calm, low, steady. The argument moved from inside to outside. Then came the impacts. The sound of something heavy striking something softer. Over and over again, Reyes returned to the body and crouched near Doyle's head. The cinder block was not symbolic. It was practical. It fit the damage perfectly. The choice of it suggested someone who wanted weight without complexity. This was not a fight. It was a reckoning staged to feel unavoidable. Inside the back bedroom, Reyes found the detail that changed the case. Tucked beneath the mattress was a small stack of photographs, bent and worn. They showed a young man in a boxing gym, hands wrapped, face bruised but smiling. In one photo, the smile was gone, replaced by swelling so severe one eye was nearly shut. On the back of that photo, a date was written. 7 years earlier. Reyes felt the shape of the night settle into place. Marcus Doyle had not been chosen at random. He had been located, confronted, and dismantled with purpose. The violence was excessive because it was specific. It was meant to mirror something already done. As the desert wind moved through the lot and the crowd thinned back into their trailers, Reyes understood that this case would not unfold forward in time. It would unfold backward, toward an injury that never healed and a moment that never stopped asking for balance. Marcus Doyle had lived long enough to believe it would never come. Tonight, someone had proven him wrong. Detective Jonah Reyes did not start with Marcus Doyle's death. He started with the photographs. They were cheap prints, the kind developed at drugstores or ordered online in batches. The corners were rounded from being handled too often. Someone had carried them for years, taken them out, put them away, returned to them again. The final photo, the one dated 7 years earlier, showed a face swollen almost beyond recognition. The bruising followed a familiar pattern. Orbital fracture, split lip, jaw misalignment. This was not a sparring injury, this was a beating. Reyes tracked the gym through signage, barely visible in the background of the images. It had been a small boxing club on the edge of town, operating out of a converted warehouse. It closed 5 years ago after repeated code violations and a civil lawsuit that drained what little money it had. The lawsuit named Marcus Doyle. Doyle had been a trainer there, unofficially, not licensed, not supervised. He ran late-night sessions for cash, pushing young fighters past safety under the guise of toughness. The lawsuit alleged assault, negligence, and permanent injury. It settled quietly. No admission of wrongdoing. No criminal charges. The injured fighter's name was Aaron Pike, 22 at the time, promising amateur record, known for endurance rather than power. The medical reports attached to the civil case were brutal: multiple facial fractures, brain swelling, damage to the optic nerve. Pike never fought again. He never worked the same kind of job again either. He returned to live with his father in a nearby county and disappeared from public view. Reyes drove there that afternoon. The Pike house was small, set back from the road, its yard overgrown, but maintained just enough to avoid notice. Aaron Pike answered the door himself. He moved slowly, carefully, his balance measured as if each step required checking. One side of his face still sat slightly lower than the other, the legacy of injuries that never healed correctly. Pike did not pretend surprise when Reyes asked about Marcus Doyle. He did not deny knowing him. He did not deny going to the trailer park. What he denied was intent to kill. Pike described the confrontation as something he had rehearsed in his head for years but never believed would actually happen. He wanted Doyle to acknowledge what he had done. He wanted him to see the damage. He brought the photos because words had failed him before. The electrical cord, Pike said, was meant to stop Doyle from attacking him first. Doyle had a reputation for violence. Pike did not trust the situation to stay verbal. The argument escalated anyway. Doyle mocked him, laughed at the limp, called the injuries weakness. Pike said something in him collapsed then, not outwardly, but inward, like a structure giving way all at once. He struck Doyle with the block, because it was there, because his hands shook too much to aim anything smaller. He kept hitting, because stopping felt like surrender. When Doyle stopped moving, Pike said, he panicked. He cut the cord because seeing Doyle bound felt wrong after everything else. He wanted Doyle to stand. He wanted him to understand what was happening as it ended. Reyes listened without interrupting. Pike's account matched the scene with unsettling accuracy. The sequence, the choice to let Doyle try to escape, the decision to finish it outside, in open space. What Pike did not express was relief. He described the night as something that had burned itself out, leaving nothing behind but exhaustion. Forensics tied Pike to the scene easily. His DNA was on the cord. His fingerprints were on the cinder block. Doyle's blood was embedded in the knees of Pike's jeans, ground in by repeated kneeling during the struggle. Pike was arrested without resistance. As Reyes drove back toward the trailer park, the sun low and harsh over the desert, he felt the familiar weight settle in. This was not a case of escalation or misunderstanding. It was a collision between past violence and delayed consequence. Marcus Doyle had walked away from what he did, believing time would dilute it. Aaron Pike had carried it intact. The trailer park would return to its routines quickly. The gym would remain closed. The photographs would be entered into evidence and sealed away. But the violence had already completed its circuit. What had been done in a warehouse years earlier had found its answer in gravel and blood, delivered not by impulse, but by memory that refused to fade. Aaron Pike did not ask what would happen next. He asked whether anyone would finally look at what Marcus Doyle had done inside that gym. Detective Jonah Reyes did not answer immediately. He had learned that answers offered too early tended to feel like bargains, and Pike was not bargaining. He was measuring whether the weight he had carried alone would now be shared, even briefly, by someone else. Reyes returned to the boxing gym after the arrest, this time with a warrant and a forensic team. Daylight stripped the place of mythology. The walls were scabbed with old impact marks. The ring ropes sagged unevenly, their tape darkened by sweat and time. In a back room, beneath a bench, technicians found a plastic bin filled with hand wraps, some clean, some stiff with dried blood. The stains were layered, old over older, never fully washed out. A ledger turned up in a locker, pages warped by moisture. It listed names, dates, cash amounts. No last names. No signatures. The same few dates appeared repeatedly, sessions that ran late into the night. One name appeared more often than the rest. Aaron. Reyes read the civil case again with this new context. Witness statements that had seemed vague now felt precise. Fighters described being told to keep going after dizziness set in. They described Doyle's voice, calm and instructive, urging endurance as if it were a virtue that replaced safety. They described being laughed at when they asked to stop. No criminal charges had followed. The gym closed. Doyle moved on. The system had absorbed the damage and continued. At the jail, Pike underwent a medical evaluation. Old injuries flared under stress. His hands shook more noticeably now. A doctor noted cognitive fatigue, difficulty with short-term recall. The consequences of the past were not theoretical. They were present in every assessment. Reyes interviewed Pike again, this time about the months leading up to the killing. Pike described trying to live around what happened, not past it. He worked jobs that tolerated his limitations. He avoided crowds, he avoided gyms. He kept the photographs because they proved something had been taken from him, even when language failed to explain it. He watched Doyle online sometimes. Social posts. New jobs. Casual jokes. The ease of it unsettled him more than anger ever had. The final decision to confront Doyle came not after a single trigger, but after realizing nothing else would change unless he forced it to. Reyes asked Pike whether he had planned to kill Doyle. Pike said no, then paused, then said he had planned not to stop if Doyle refused to listen. That distinction mattered to Pike. It mattered less to the law. The prosecutor reviewed the case with an eye toward inevitability. The evidence was overwhelming. The confession was clean. The violence was undeniable. But there was also context that refused to be ignored. Years of documented abuse. A civil settlement that silenced accountability. A victim whose injuries never stopped accumulating interest. Reyes watched the case harden into its final shape. There would be no surprise turns, no dramatic revelations. The story would move forward on rails, laid long before the trailer shook from the second blow. As evening settled over the desert, Reyes drove past the trailer park again. The porch light was off now. The gravel had been raked and washed. Children rode bikes between trailers as if nothing permanent had happened there. Marcus Doyle's trailer would be rented again. The gym would remain empty. Aaron Pike sat in a cell, his body aching in familiar ways, his mind quieter than it had been in years. The violence had not healed him, but it had ended the argument he had been having with the past. And that, Reyes understood, was why it had been so thorough. Aaron Pike entered his plea without ceremony. He stood before the judge with his hands folded at his waist, posture careful, as if balance still required thought. He did not look toward the gallery. He did not look at the prosecutor. When asked whether he wished to address the court, he said no. then corrected himself and said only that everything he had done was his responsibility. Nothing more. The evidence made the outcome inevitable. First-degree murder was reduced to second degree under a plea agreement that acknowledged provocation without excusing consequence. The sentence was long enough to remove Pike from the world he had already struggled to navigate. Short enough, some said, to suggest mercy. Pike did not react to the number when it was read. Detective Jonah Reyes watched from the back of the courtroom. He felt no satisfaction, only closure of a procedural kind. The law had done what it could with what it was given. It could not rewind time. It could not restore the years Pike lost to dizziness, pain, and limitation. It could only place an ending where one had already been forced. After sentencing, Reyes returned to the boxing gym one last time. The building was being demolished that week, its contents already cleared out. The ring lay collapsed, ropes slack and dusty. The ledger and wraps were boxed as evidence, their relevance finally acknowledged, too late to matter to anyone who had already been hurt. The gym came down quickly. Walls folded inward. Dust filled the air. Nothing about the structure suggested what it had once been. Marcus Doyle's name appeared briefly in local coverage, attached to his death and little else. His past actions were mentioned in a single paragraph, framed carefully, neutrally. No charges followed. No posthumous reckoning arrived. The story moved on. Aaron Pike was transferred south to a state facility as summer heat settled over the desert. The ride was long and quiet. Through the bus window, the landscape flattened into distance. Pike watched it pass without attachment. He did not look like a man relieved. He looked like a man whose waiting had ended. Reyes filed the final report weeks later. It was factual, restrained, and complete. Marcus Doyle assaulted a young fighter. The system failed to intervene. Years later, that failure returned as violence. One man was dead. One man was imprisoned. Nothing about it balanced cleanly. On his drive home that night, Reyes passed the trailer park again. A new tenant had moved into Doyle's old unit. The porch light glowed warm. Laughter carried briefly through an open window, then faded as a door closed. Life continued, indifferent to symmetry. Reyes understood, in the end, that revenge murders rarely spread outward. They collapsed inward, consuming only those bound tightly enough to the original harm. Aaron Pike had not acted to create chaos. He had acted to stop remembering. The cost had been high, permanent, and irreversible. But for the first time since the night in that gym, the past was no longer waiting for him to answer. It was finished. Now let's get into another story for tonight. The bar stayed open because no one had ever proven it should close. It sat alone on a stretch of highway where the asphalt softened into dirt shoulders and the desert pushed close enough to listen. The sign flickered between letters, losing its name in pieces as the night wore on. People stopped there when they were already tired of explaining themselves. That was where Lena Price was last seen alive. She came in just before midnight, ordered whiskey without ice, and drank it fast. The bartender remembered her hands shaking slightly when she lifted the glass. Not fear, exactly. Something closer to urgency. She asked if anyone had been asking for her. The bartender said no. Lena stayed anyway. She left with a man no one recognized. The motel was 3 miles down the road, a low strip of rooms that smelled like bleach and old cigarettes. Lena signed the register herself. The handwriting was steady. That detail would matter later. People in danger often wrote differently. The room was quiet until it wasn't. What happened inside the bathroom was not sudden. The mirror cracked from a single impact, but the sink was damaged by several. Blood streaked the tile in long, uneven lines that suggested movement rather than collapse. The shower curtain was torn down and trampled, its rings bent out of shape as if someone had tried to pull themselves upright more than once. Lena died on the bathroom floor. The injuries told a simple story made complicated by time. She was hit, then hit again after she tried to stand. Her throat was crushed by sustained pressure, not a strike. Fingers left bruises beneath the skin, deeper on one side than the other, indicating a hand that did not hesitate once it found the right position. There was no sign of sexual assault, no theft. Her purse lay open on the bed, wallet untouched, phone missing. The man who left the room wiped the sink, not thoroughly, but deliberately. He cleaned the places his hands had been, not the places her blood had reached. He shut the door carefully behind him and did not run. Lena Price was 29 years old. She worked sporadically as a tattoo artist, drifting between shops when the work dried up, or the people around her began asking questions she did not want to answer. She had no fixed address, no criminal record, no restraining orders filed under her name, but she had been running. Receipts found in her bag showed short stays in 5 different towns over 6 weeks. Cash payments, different names used casually, not forged, just altered enough to buy time. A notebook tucked into the lining of her jacket held phone numbers with no names attached, some crossed out, some circled hard enough to tear the paper. One page held a single sentence, written twice. He knows. The bartender's description of the man was vague, but unsettling. Average height, average build, neutral clothes. He did not watch Lena while she drank. He watched the door. When Lena finally stood, he moved with her, without being invited or refused. The bartender said it looked less like a pickup and more like recognition. The motel camera caught the man leaving alone at 1:42 a.m. He walked normally, hands in his pockets, head down against the wind. The footage glitched briefly as he passed beneath the light. When it stabilized, he was already at his truck. The truck was old, clean, unremarkable. No license plate could be read. Lena Price had been dead for less than 10 minutes. The story did not begin with her death. It began weeks earlier, in a different town, with something Lena had seen and failed to forget. Lena had not meant to see it. That was the detail that returned again and again in the fragments she left behind. Not intention, not curiosity, not meddling. Accident. A wrong turn, followed by the decision not to look away fast enough. 6 weeks earlier, she was working a short run at a tattoo studio in a border town that filled and emptied on weekends. The shop stayed open late because walk-ins paid in cash, and questions cost time. Lena liked those hours. People told the truth more easily when they were tired. Near closing, the power cut out without warning. It lasted less than a minute. Long enough for the music to stop. Long enough for the air conditioner to sigh and fall silent. Long enough for someone in the back hallway to swear softly, not startled, just inconvenienced. When the lights came back on, Lena was alone in the front. She went looking because that was what people did when something felt unfinished. The hallway led to a storage room the shop rarely used, a space borrowed from the building next door and sealed off with a door that should have been locked. It was open instead, angled just enough to suggest recent use. Inside, the room was too clean, not empty clean, but prepared. The concrete floor had been washed recently, leaving pale streaks where water dried unevenly. A folding table stood against one wall with nothing on it except a roll of plastic sheeting and a small handheld recorder, powered on, its red light steady. The sound came from behind her. She turned, and saw a man standing in the doorway she had just come through, blocking it without effort. He did not raise his hands. He did not rush. He watched her face carefully, as if waiting for a particular expression to appear. He apologized. Not for frightening her, for the inconvenience. He said she was not supposed to be there yet. That word stayed with her. Yet, she backed up slowly, hands visible, already calculating how much distance the room offered, and how quickly it could disappear. The man did not follow. He stepped aside instead, giving her a clear path out. That was the mistake that convinced her the danger was real. People who meant no harm did not plan exits. She left without running. She finished her shift. She told no one. That night, she packed her things and took a bus out before morning. She did not know what she had seen exactly, only that it did not want witnesses and had expected privacy. The recorder haunted her. In the weeks that followed, Lena changed names the way other people changed shirts. She stayed just long enough in each place to make money and disappear again. She avoided tattooing anything permanent, favoring flash designs that required less conversation. She slept lightly and woke often. She began to notice the truck. At first it appeared only once, parked across the street or idling at a light. Old, clean, always the same dull color that refused to stand out. She told herself it was coincidence, until coincidence began to arrive on a schedule. She wrote the sentence in her notebook the first night she saw it twice in the same town. He knows. At the roadside bar, she drank fast because she was tired of carrying the weight alone. She asked if anyone had been asking for her because she needed the answer to be no, even if it was only for an hour. When the man walked in and took the seat beside her without looking at her face, she understood the waiting was over. He did not threaten her. He did not accuse her. He spoke about logistics, about how difficult it was to keep things quiet when people wandered. He told her she had done nothing wrong yet. He asked her to come talk somewhere private. She went because refusing would have made the end louder. In the motel room, he asked her what she remembered. She answered carefully, truthfully, believing that accuracy might save her. She described the room, the table, the plastic, the recorder. She did not describe fear. She did not need to. The man listened with interest that never turned into concern. When she finished, he nodded once and said that was enough. What followed was not rage, it was correction. The pressure on her throat came after she tried to stand. The hands were practiced, thumbs finding purchase beneath her jaw, fingers settling where resistance weakened fastest. He watched her eyes while he did it, not for pleasure, but for confirmation. When it was over, he cleaned only what he had touched. He took her phone because memory traveled faster than paper. He left the room the way he entered the bar, without hurry, without display. The recorder in the storage room was never recovered. Neither was the truck. Lena Price's story did not end in the bathroom. It ended the moment she decided that seeing something did not obligate her to forget it. The man who killed her was counting on that impulse. He had been right often enough to trust it. After Lena Price died, the places she passed through began to change their behavior. Nothing dramatic, no sirens or closures. Just small adjustments that only mattered if you were looking for them. A tattoo shop replaced a backroom lock. A motel clerk started photocopying IDs after midnight. A bus station manager reported a man lingering too long near the lockers and was told it was probably nothing. The man adjusted too. The truck stopped appearing twice in the same town. He began arriving earlier, staying shorter. The cadence tightened. Where there had once been patience, there was now efficiency. Witnesses were a variable, and variables required correction. In a different county, a storage facility worker discovered a room that did not belong to any renter. It was hidden behind a false wall, accessed through a service corridor marked electrical. Inside was a folding table, plastic sheeting, and a portable recorder identical to the one Lena had seen. The batteries were fresh. The recorder held no sound. Someone had been waiting. Elsewhere, a housekeeper found a notebook in a motel trash bin, half burned but not destroyed. Most of the pages were ash, but one survived long enough to be cataloged. It contained phone numbers without names, and a single sentence written twice, the ink pressed hard enough to scar the paper. He knows. The sentence moved through reports without comment. It did not explain anything. It simply repeated. A pattern began to emerge without anyone naming it as such. People who vanished shared a similarity that had nothing to do with age, gender, or work. They had all been briefly out of place shortly before disappearing. A wrong hallway. A locked door left open. A room that should have been empty. They had all looked. The recordings, when they surfaced, showed no escalation. The man did not grow angrier or sloppier. He refined. He shortened interactions. He stopped asking questions. Where he once explained, he now confirmed silently. The process no longer required conversation. What changed was his documentation. Early recordings were carefully framed, faces centered, sound levels adjusted. Later ones were tighter, cropped closer, often cutting off the top of the subject's head. The camera began closer to the floor. Less context, less room. It was not about memory anymore. It was about proof. In one recovered clip, the man leaned close to the camera before turning it off. His face filled the frame briefly. Calm, focused, almost relieved. He checked the lens with the same care someone might check a mirror before leaving the house. No name was attached to the face. The places he used were erased afterward, not destroyed, but returned to neutrality. Plastic folded and removed. Floors washed. Locks replaced. The rooms forgot themselves quickly. The absence of chaos was what allowed it to continue. No one screamed in public. No scenes spilled into streets. The violence stayed contained, private, procedural. It traveled on back roads and through service entrances, slipping between expectations. Lena Price became a reference point without anyone meaning her to be. Her death marked the shift from patience to pace. Whatever restraint had once governed the man ended with her. She had not tried to expose him, she had tried to survive him. That attempt had been enough. By the time the final uncrossed name was quietly removed from a calendar no one ever found, the man no longer needed lists. He recognized the type instantly. The pause before entering a room. The glance that lingered too long. The instinct to remember instead of dismiss. He did not hate those people. He needed them to stop existing. Somewhere along a highway that never appeared on news reports, a truck idled briefly before moving on. Inside it, the camera was already charged, the recorder empty, the plastic folded cleanly. There was still time before anyone understood what they were looking for. And time, as it turned out, was the only thing he had ever needed. The end did not arrive with violence. It arrived with a mistake. The man had learned to trust pattern over urgency, but pattern required repetition, and repetition eventually created friction. The room he chose this time was almost right. An old roadside motel being gutted in stages, half closed, half operating. Contractors came during the day. Travelers filled the remaining rooms at night. The overlap created noise that felt like cover. It was not. He prepared the space as he always did, careful and clean, working from habit rather than thought. The recorder was placed. The plastic was measured and cut. The camera was mounted lower than before, closer to the floor, closer to certainty. He waited because waiting had always been rewarded. The person who entered did not panic. That was new. She paused in the doorway, took in the room, and did not step forward. She did not ask questions. She did not try to negotiate. She looked at the camera first, then at him, and something in her expression shifted, not to fear, but to recognition. She said his name. He did not correct her. No one ever had before. The sound that followed was not shouting. It was the recorder hitting the floor when he moved too quickly to stop her from leaving. The camera kept running, tilted now, capturing only the lower half of the room as they collided out of frame. The violence that followed was clumsy, shortened by surprise. There was no pacing, no calibration. He lost control of sequence, and sequence had always been the point. She escaped with injuries that would never be made public. She did not give interviews. She did not tell the story the way people expected it to be told. She gave specifics without drama, locations, access points, timings. She described rooms, not acts. That was enough. The places he had used began to surface, not all at once, but steadily, like a tide that did not recede. Storage rooms behind false walls. Basements with drains scrubbed too often. A truck whose interior had been modified with care that suggested long practice. Recordings that showed the same hands, the same posture, the same calm impatience with delay. He did not fight when he was found. He did not speak either. In the final inventory, investigators found no manifesto, no confession, no explanation that could be summarized neatly. They found tools, they found recordings, they found calendars without names, only dates, some crossed out, others left blank, as if waiting for meaning to arrive later. Lena Price appeared only once in the material, not as a subject, but as a note, a deviation. The rooms were dismantled. The truck was stripped and crushed. The recorder models were pulled from shelves quietly. No announcement was made. There was no moment of communal release. People who had been briefly out of place continued living without knowing how close they had been to becoming an entry rather than a memory. The roadside bar stayed open. The motel changed hands. The storage room behind the tattoo shop was locked properly this time. And somewhere, in a box that would not be opened again, a burned notebook page sat among evidence, the sentence still faintly visible where the fire had not finished its work. He knows. In the end, it was not exposure that stopped him, it was interruption. A single moment where habit failed, sequence broke, and someone refused to move the way he expected. For a man who built his life on control of space and time, that refusal was catastrophic. The rooms went quiet. The waiting ended. And the world resumed its careless habit of not looking too closely at the places where it almost disappeared. Now, let's dive into the next story for tonight. Here's the opening installment of your true crime story, written in a restrained, journalistic narrative style with an immersive sense of realism and unease. The setting is authentic to time and place, with a focus on verisimilitude and slow-building tension. Title: The Quiet Guest of Logan Square, Chicago, Autumn 1987. The year had folded into that brittle season when daylight came late and left too soon, when the air pressed close with the dull iron tang of lake wind. Logan Square was still more working class than fashionable then, a maze of two flats with cracked steps and leaning wrought iron fences where the L-tracks murmured through corners of twilight. Streetlights hummed over patchy sod and the persistent scent of gasoline rising from Western Avenue. People worked, came home, locked their doors, and minded their business. It was into this tired rhythm that Elliot Crane moved on September 2nd, 1987, carrying only 2 canvas bags and a quiet smile. The landlord remembered him as soft-spoken, polite, and unremarkable. A man in his mid-30s with neatly combed blonde hair and a slight Midwestern accent. He said he was a freelance technician, picking up contracts for radio repair. No one asked more than that. In Chicago, neighbors shared walls, but not always their stories. For 2 months, life in the worn brick building at 2709 North Albany Avenue passed undisturbed. Elliot paid rent in cash, waved to the family across the hallway, and kept odd hours. His lights came on after midnight. The faint pulse of talk radio drifted through the vents. He was courteous, almost deferential, and for that reason, invisible. Yet by the first week of November, whispers began passing through the tenants about a smell. It started as something faint, metallic and sweet, mistaken for burnt wiring or a dead mouse in a vent. A young mother on the second floor called maintenance. The super-sprayed disinfectant mopped the hallway and said he'd look into it. But the odor persisted, thicker by the day, leaking through cracks behind the stairs. The autumn air had turned cold, windows sealed tight. What festered inside had nowhere to go. Police were called on November 12th after tenants complained of a chemical stench. The responding officer, Patrolman Diaz, later told reporters that the property manager handed him a spare key to apartment 3R. The tenant, Elliot Crane, had not been seen since early that week. Inside, every curtain was drawn, dishes sat clean on the counter, and a transistor radio hummed low static on the floor. What Diaz found in the back room stunned even the seasoned detectives who followed. The scene wasn't one of rage, but of procedure. Carefully organized instruments, labeled glass jars, and half-sealed painter's plastic lining the wall. In one metal tub lay what appeared to be fragments of plaster, but closer inspection revealed them to be bones, bleached and cut. The air carried a clinging scent of rot, masked by ammonia. Forensics technicians spent 3 days cataloging evidence. They discovered 2 sets of human remains and fibers from at least one additional victim. No identification was possible on site. The heat and chemicals had done their work. Fingerprints lifted from jars and tools, all traced to the same person, Elliot Crane. Yet there were none from the victims, as if their existence had been carefully erased. Reporters gathered outside the building before dawn on the 14th, their camera lenses fogging in the early chill. The Tribune ran its headline the next morning, "Mystery Tenant Linked to Possible Murders in Logan Square." The case carried echoes of another horror that still lurked in the city's memory. A decade earlier, the discovery of John Wayne Gacy's victims outside DePlain had left Chicago with deep scars of unease. Now, here was another quiet man with a disarming smile and unknowable nights. Detectives with the Violent Crimes Unit began digging into Elliot's background. There was little to find. His social security number was real, but recently reissued. His driver's license came from Minnesota, listing an address that had burned down months before. There were no credit records prior to 1986, no next of kin, no known employer who remembered him. He existed neatly on paper, but nowhere in lived memory. Neighbors offered fragments of routine. They remembered the rhythmic tapping that came from his apartment at late hours, as though someone carefully filing metal. They told of the small parcels he received marked lab equipment. A few recalled catching sight of him loading heavy trash bags into the alley dumpster, always late at night, always alone. No one recalled seeing another person enter his apartment until that October, when a young man with dark hair appeared on the steps, knocking, and was invited in. That visitor, later identified as Adam Sutter, age 22, was last seen alive that same week, leaving his night shift at a gas station on Milwaukee Avenue. His mother filed a missing persons report the following Sunday. Police now understood what had happened to Adam, though confirmation by dental records would take weeks. Inside Elliot's living room, investigators found dozens of notebooks. Most were ordinary. Shopping lists, repair estimates, fragments of instructions relating to electronic circuits. But among them lay pages filled with anatomical diagrams and cryptic notations in precise, blocky handwriting. No confessions, no emotional outpouring, only observation. A forensic psychologist who later reviewed them told journalists they read like technical manuals detached from empathy. The manhunt began quietly, but escalated as more discoveries surfaced. In a rented locker near O'Hare, officers located a blue duffel bag containing stained work gloves, dental tools, and Polaroids sealed in manila envelopes. The photographs, blurred but unmistakable, showed partial torsos posed under bright light against that same painter's plastic. The last time stamp was November 8th, 4 days before the apartment's discovery. Elliot Crane was now the most wanted man in Illinois. As fear spread, newspapers ran grainy ID photos of his thin, watchful face. Rewards were posted. Hotlines lit up with leads from diners, train stations, and halfway houses. Every tip pointed to a ghost. He had withdrawn $600 in cash from a bank on Belmont Avenue before disappearing. His aging blue Chevrolet Nova turned up abandoned near the Indiana border, its interior wiped clean, prints removed except one faint smudge on the rearview mirror. Weeks passed. Thanksgiving arrived gray and cold. The building on Albany Avenue stood empty behind police tape, a hollow echo in the neighborhood. One more Chicago address whispered in caution. Yet investigators understood what silence often meant. He was either long gone or patiently waiting somewhere close enough to watch. A neighbor later told detectives she thought she glimpsed him again that winter, stepping from an alley at dusk, collar up, face half hidden under a wool cap. The sighting was never confirmed, but something in her voice, the chill certainty of recognition, unsettled even the officers taking her statement. By early December 1987, with no trace of Elliot Crane, the case stalled. Evidence continued processing in laboratories across Cook County. 2 victims identified, 1 still unknown. The city, weary from its own dark history, absorbed this latest horror with grim familiarity. What haunted those who had entered the apartment wasn't the brutality. It was the order of it, the absence of frenzy, implied method, perhaps experimentation. There were no signatures of impulse, no theft, no sign of struggle, only the sterile veneer of someone who studied destruction as if it were craft. And somewhere beyond the thawing streets, beneath Chicago's winter haze, they believed that order continued. The man who had built a laboratory of bones was still out there, moving unnoticed through the crowd, as the city prepared to sleep under another slate-gray sky. Here's the continuation of the story, following the same investigative tone and true crime narrative style. Title: The Quiet Guest of Logan Square Winter 1988, Northern Indiana. Snow had frozen the fields outside Gary into cracked plains of white. Smoke curled from refinery stacks like slow incense against the sky. Freight trains moved along the edge of town, their horns echoing through valleys of rusted grain silos. It was here, 60 miles from Chicago, that a janitor unlocking a shuttered storage depot made a discovery that pulled the investigation back from silence. Inside Unit 47B, the rent had lapsed for 3 consecutive months. The facility manager, following procedure, cut the padlock on January 10, 1988. A thin blade of light spilled across stacked plastic bins and rows of makeshift shelves. The first bin, when lifted, contained coiled wire and lengths of clear tubing labeled in neat black script. The second held camera equipment. The third contained a single wooden box, and inside it were dozens of Polaroids, faces of men caught in clinical light. Some smiled faintly, others looked drowsy, unfocused. Each photo bore a number on the border, but no names. The local police notified Chicago immediately. Detectives from the Violent Crimes Unit arrived before dawn, carefully unloading thousands of items. The cataloging took days. Amid the equipment, investigators uncovered blood-stained drop cloths and receipts from a pharmacy in Hammond dated late November, proof that Elliot Crane had crossed state lines after abandoning his car. The signature on the receipts matched his handwriting. FBI jurisdiction opened next. By February, a multi-state task force existed, headquartered in downtown Chicago, its narrow office dimly lit by buzzing fluorescent panels and the steam of uneaten coffee. Every agent knew the file. Crane, Elliot, a.k.a. John Moore, a.k.a. Alan Hark. 3 aliases attached to varying photographs, each subtly different in hairstyle and expression. The earliest dated back to 1979 in St. Paul, where he'd once rented a basement apartment beneath a health supply store. Old paperwork suggested he'd taken correspondence courses in electronics and biology. Journalists compared him to a phantom archivist, someone who kept records not for memory, but for control. Photographs from the storage unit spanned nearly a decade, stretching back further than anyone expected. Patterns emerged. Each subject, a young male, often transient or isolated, vanished without notice. Terrible arithmetic followed. If the dates aligned, Elliot's crimes might have begun long before Chicago ever knew his name. But even now, there was no trace of where he might have gone. Credit systems were thinner then, less easily traced. He used cash, received mail under false P.O. boxes, and stayed invisible among the warehouse laborers and roadside diners of the Midwest. What the investigators possessed were scraps. The curvature of background tiles in a photo, freight tags hinting at geography, and a sequence of date stamps pointing south and east. By March, the task force believed with cautious certainty that Crane was following old freight corridors toward Ohio. The press coverage swelled again, painting him alternately as a scientific sadist, a drifter with singular precision, or a hoax inflated by panicked rumor. Each theory tugged him further from reality, substituting myth for evidence. Yet while reporters wrote headlines, forensic analysts pored through a single extraordinary find. Microscopic residues on the tubing recovered from Gary, traced to a proprietary solvent used primarily in optical manufacturing facilities. Only one plant in the region used that formula, a lens polishing contractor in Toledo. Investigators arrived at the plant on March 4th, requesting employment rosters. The foreman recalled a recent hire under the name Aaron L., mid-30s, quiet, technically gifted, always early for his shift. His locker contained nothing but a change of work clothes and a worn manual for vacuum sealers. He'd stopped showing up 2 weeks earlier, around the time the storage unit's lock was cut. Payroll gave them his address, a boarding house off Dorr Street. By the time detectives arrived, the room was stripped bare, except for a cot, a dented tea kettle, and an unplugged lamp. A single Polaroid remained tucked under the mattress, an image of the Lake Michigan shore at night, taken from some unfamiliar angle, the frame marked home. That photograph shifted the investigation's focus back toward Illinois. Analysts in Chicago reviewed missing persons reports again, concentrating on anyone last seen near the lakefront through late '87. One stood out. Daniel Kroll, age 25, graduate student at DePaul University. He'd been reported missing a week before Crane's disappearance. Records showed Kroll had corresponded with someone by mail about selling used radio parts. His roommate said a blond man had come by their apartment one evening to pick up the boxes. Dental confirmation later linked Kroll as the third victim recovered from the Albany Avenue apartment. The discovery deepened public outrage, but it also added weight to a chilling assumption inside the task force. Crane selected victims for ease of access, but his motives were not financial. Each set of items found in his possession, lenses, scalpels, nitrile gloves, indicated methodical study. There was talk among forensic analysts that he might have been documenting decomposition or testing chemical exposure. Others believed he was staging experiments on perception itself, using light and distortion in his photography. But those were speculations layered over a core truth. He killed, preserved, and vanished, leaving no emotional footprint. Through spring, the case began eroding under its own magnitude. Tips grew inconsistent. Sightings multiplied across 3 states. The Bureau quietly scaled back resources by May. New leads stopped arriving until one humid night in June, when a body was recovered from the Calumet River. An unidentified male, weighted and decomposed beyond recognition. In his jacket were laminated work passes for a Toledo factory under the name Aaron L. The fingerprints matched those of Elliot Crane. Officially, the chase ended there. The coroner listed cause of death as drowning, though toxicology suggested high levels of sedative. Whether suicide or escape gone wrong remained uncertain. The body was cremated a month later under state order, the case declared closed. But for many of the investigators, closure meant little. Evidence lockers still held hundreds of unclassified photographs. At least 6 faces had never matched missing persons files. Storage invoices from across the Midwest hinted at more units still unopened. 2 were traced to P.O. boxes in Milwaukee and Madison, but the keys were never found. Reporters lost interest as quickly as they'd once swarmed. By the fall of 1988, the coverage faded to an occasional anniversary column. The building in Logan Square reopened under a new owner, its walls repainted, its memory sealed behind cement and whitewash. Locals spoke of it with unease, but also with the resignation of a city that had seen too much. Still, inside the archives of the Cook County Sheriff's Office, evidence boxes sat untouched for years. Technicians moving them decades later would occasionally pause over the meticulous handwriting, the unblemished order of his notes. Some who worked that shift swore they found an unfamiliar signature among the newer logs, initials that shouldn't have been there, written in the same deliberate style, dated months after the official closing of the case. Whether simple misfiling or something more, no one could prove. But it was enough to make veteran detectives glance once more at the shadowed hallways of the past, wondering if the quiet guest of Logan Square had ever truly left. Here's the 3rd installment of the story, continuing in the same factual, restrained, and atmospheric true crime tone. Title: The Quiet Guest of Logan Square, Chicago, Spring 2009. The evidence boxes from the Crane investigation had gathered more than 2 decades of dust in the basement of the Cook County Sheriff's Office. Their labels, printed in fading typewriter ink, Crane Elliott 1987-1988 closed files, had yellowed at the edges. When the archive modernization project began in March 2009, the team assigned to digitize cold cases rediscovered them by chance. The intern who signed out the first box, Rachel Lang, was 26. Recently graduated from Northwestern's criminology program. She had grown up in suburban Bolingbrook, too young to remember the news stories, but old enough to have heard fragments whispered by relatives. The Logan Square Bones, the quiet man who cut himself out of history. Her job wasn't glamorous. Scan old photos, log serial numbers, record paper trails before storage. But by the second week, the Crane file had taken peculiar hold of her. the inventory didn't align. Several evidence tags listed attachments that were missing. Specifically, a roll of undeveloped 35mm negatives and a single logbook described in a 1988 summary report as Item 114. Personal notes, recovered from storage facility, Gary, Indiana. The bag where it should have been was empty, except for lint and the stale chemical odor of film emulsion. When Lang asked her supervisor, she was told the file had been closed for over 20 years. Paperwork errors were common. Photographs degrade, he said. Paper vanishes. Happens all the time. Still, it bothered her. The original catalog referenced 16 canisters of film taken from the storage unit, but only 15 had been scanned and archived before the case's closure. Another staffer later recalled handing that final roll to a former analyst named Heller, a forensics photographer who retired in 1990 and now lived outside Peoria. That spring, Lang drove down to interview Heller for clarification, thinking it might fill a footnote in the archive. What she found only deepened the riddle. Heller, then 78, lived alone in a house pressed between cornfields, its siding faded to tobacco yellow. He answered questions methodically, hands steadied by decades in dark rooms. When she mentioned the missing negatives, his expression faltered. He remembered them. 16 rolls, yes, but one was undeveloped when the Bureau ceased fieldwork. I offered to process it myself, he said, for completeness. He claimed he never received authorization and eventually returned it to evidence. Yet the official ledger showed no return log. Then it's gone, Heller said simply. Lost in the Bureau's house cleaning. Happens more than anyone likes to admit. His voice stayed calm, but as Lang noted later in her report, his eyes didn't. They shifted toward the living room wall, where a set of black and white photographs, still lives of empty rooms, alleys, windowsills, hung in mismatched frames. She thought one seemed oddly familiar. A photograph of a stairwell, steep and narrow, walls covered in peeling paint. It looked exactly like the entrance to 2709 North Albany Avenue before its renovation. Heller noticed her gaze and changed the subject. Lang returned to Chicago uneasy but determined. The following month, she reviewed scanned negatives from the recovered 15 rolls. Most images showed evidence documentation: the jars, tools, interior of the Albany apartment. But toward the end of one roll, she discovered 3 exposures overlooked in the original indexing. Each portrayed the same location from successive angles: the tiled room where bones had been found, taken after the scene had been cleared. In the third photograph, reflected faintly in the polished steel of the tub, was the blurred outline of a man's figure standing where no one should have been. The timestamp on the film read December 3rd, 1987, 3 weeks after detectives had vacated the site, when the property had still been under police seal. The reflection wasn't conclusive. It might have been an artifact of double exposure, a trick of light. Lang reported it to her supervisor, who added a brief note to the database: anomalous image / no verification required. The case remained closed. 2 weeks later, Lang began receiving anonymous emails sent from temporary accounts, cryptic lines such as "you have the wrong count" and "not all the rooms were found." IT traced them to public computers in the loop, impossible to follow. At first she assumed a prank. Old cases attracted amateur sleuths online. Then the subject line shifted. Did you talk to Heller? Did you see his walls? She contacted the sheriff's office, reporting harassment. The messages ceased for a week, then resumed, this time attaching low-resolution images, dark interior shots she did not recognize. One showed a fluorescent bulb flickering over an empty metal table. Another showed what looked like the edge of a newspaper dated May 2009. Detectives opened a minor inquiry, but dropped it soon after, concluding the source was likely a, quote, case enthusiast. Lang's anxiety grew. In June, she took leave, citing stress, but the photograph she had scanned, what she saw in the reflection, continued to stir debate among those who reviewed it. Senior analysts proposed it was indeed double exposure, one undeveloped frame accidentally rewound over an earlier image during processing. Others weren't so certain. The figure's contour, barely discernible yet distinct, was positioned in a way that suggested deliberate presence, not accident. It appeared to face the camera. Around that time, a retired investigator, Detective Leon Thomas, who had worked the original task force, contacted her. He'd read her preliminary notes online through an internal bulletin and wanted to talk. Thomas had spent 20 years believing the case ended with the drowned body. The sight of renewed movement unsettled him. They met at a diner off I-55 the following month. Thomas confessed that he, too, had doubts about the body recovered from the Calumet River. Identification had been based solely on partial prints and dental fragments, sufficient for bureaucracy, not certainty. He'd pushed for DNA testing when technology improved in the late 90s, but was denied funding. "Every time I look at that scene in my head," he said, "I hear silence, like unfinished work." Lang listened, notebook open but hands still. He slid across the table a photocopy of a letter that had arrived at district headquarters in 1991, addressed to him without a return stamp. Its text was typed on an old machine, single page, unsigned. "You looked in the wrong unit. You never found 14A. For decades, Thomas had dismissed it. Another crank message." But the rediscovered negatives now forced him to reconsider. The Gary facility had units numbered only up to 60. 14A hadn't existed on record. Yet internal audits from the storage company hinted at secondary lots on leased land nearby, numbers missing from formal inventory during the 1988 seizure. That night, Lang returned home with the copy folded into her jacket, unable to sleep. She pulled up historical property maps of the area outside Gary and located an extension once owned by the same storage corporation, long since demolished. The demolition report listed one unverified steel container, removed to private sale before inspection, unaccounted for in all later documentation. The address associated with its buyer led not to Indiana, but to a warehouse conversion on the outskirts of Milwaukee, registered under an inactive business called Midwestern Optics Limited. The registration date was January 1988, 1 month after Elliot Crane disappeared. And so, more than 20 years after the manhunt had ended, a new trail emerged, fragile but unmistakable, pointing north through the snow-choked industrial artery of the lake's western shore. The building at the end of Commerce Street looked like any other abandoned warehouse along the river. Brick eaten away by frost, windows blind with dust, a pale stencil of its former sign still faintly visible beneath graffiti. Midwestern Optics Limited. Officially, it had ceased operation in 1991 after bankruptcy. Unofficially, its interior hadn't seen visitors in years. Rachel Lang and retired detective Leon Thomas stood outside the padlocked gate one gray October morning, breathing fog into the cold. The property was under city repossession status, which meant municipal clearance could be filed without much notice. Thomas had obtained an inspection warrant through old colleagues, archival security check, he'd called it. They wore flashlights at their belts, their movements nervous but deliberate, aware of how thin their authority really was. Inside, the air smelled of oil and mildew. Floorboards moaned under the loose weight of nails. Light from the river filtered through cracked panes and yellow slats. They passed through what had once been a packaging area. conveyor belts draped with cobwebs, rusted presses faced with plaques labeled lens calibration. And then, behind a partition wall, they found something stranger. A metal door stood embedded in the brick, incongruous with the factory's layout, newer than its surroundings. The hinges were industrial grade, reinforced. Thomas pried it open with a steel bar, his breath shuddering with effort. Beyond the threshold lay a small concrete room, clean in a way no abandoned place ever is. The interior seemed almost staged. Along one wall ran rows of metal filing drawers, marked by letters A through G. On the opposite wall hung an array of photographs shielded under thick plastic, hundreds of them, methodically aligned, the top edges pinpricked in uniform spacing. Each photograph showed the same feature: a human face, centrally framed, washed in white overhead light. No visible injury, no overt horror. Yet something in them radiated calculation, the emptiness of documentation. The files held more, not manual entries or schematics, but handwritten data charts. Weight, pulse rate, behavior notes, scribbled beside initials and dates ranging from 1985 to 1988. Every month between those years accounted for except December 1987, the month Crane disappeared. At the back of the room, beneath a cloth sheet, sat a large covered shape. Lang hesitated before drawing it free. Beneath was an antique enlarger, an optical printer, its wiring rewound, modified with salvaged transistors. A red bulb still hung overhead, wired to a generator fused against the wall. Dust coated everything, but the setup bore no signs of long neglect. The cables were fresh. The plug, when Thomas tested it, sparked faintly with residual charge. Someone had been here recently. Lang's skin prickled. On the table beside the enlarger lay a notebook bound with cord. Her gloved hand trembled as she opened to the first page. The handwriting, angular, precise, was the same seen on Crane's recovered labels, but these entries dated from 1989 to 2008. Locations shifted: Milwaukee, Duluth, Kalamazoo, and each year listed sample counts, method notes, and final remarks entered in identical phrasing: observation complete, preservation achieved. For a long time, they said nothing. Thomas backed away slowly, whispering that they needed to alert authorities. But before they could move toward the exit, a faint mechanical sound, like a camera's shutter, clicked somewhere beyond the concrete wall. It repeated, deliberate, once, twice, then silence. Thomas wheeled his flashlight toward the sound. A ventilation grate flickered back at them, the space behind it absolute dark. The beam caught on something metallic, perhaps wiring, perhaps not. Lang's mouth went dry. She stepped back, pulse loud in her ears. The third click came closer, from the shadows behind the machinery. They fled, first walking quickly, then running through the corridors until daylight broke over the warped assembly floor. Every footfall echoed through emptiness. When they made it outside, they realized neither had spoken since the first sound. Thomas called dispatch from the car, his voice trembling but measured. Within 20 minutes, a city response team arrived. The warehouse was sealed by late afternoon, but after repeated searches extending over 2 days, investigators claimed no photographs, no filing cabinets, no notebook. Only bare concrete and debris. The basement space, they said, reeked faintly of ozone and photographic fixer, but nothing else remained. Lang and Thomas were quietly told to step aside, their warrant rescinded for administrative overreach. Their statements entered the record and went nowhere. Within weeks, the county issued a standard finding: structure cleared, no criminal materials present. Lang resigned from the archival project soon after. Her official memo cited psychological exhaustion. What she did not mention was the recurring image she could not shake, the faces beneath plastic, expressionless under white light, their pupils reflecting the flash exactly as the blurred figure had in that old 1987 photograph. Thomas vanished from official correspondence a year later, his phone disconnected, his apartment emptied. Friends assumed he had moved closer to his children in Kansas. No forwarding address existed. By mid-2010, demolition began on the Commerce Street warehouse. In the rubble, workers uncovered fragments of charred negatives fused together in a single black mass. The construction foreman, unaware of the site's history, discarded them with other refuse. Only one laborer, sorting through the debris, noticed something peculiar buried near a drain. A fragment of ID badge melted at the edge, its laminate peeling but the letters legible. Chicago DIV, Tech SVCS, CRANE, E. The worker pocketed it, and never reported what he'd found. Months passed. The story slipped into rumor again. The way most tragedies do, transmuted by retelling into urban caution. Apartments in Logan Square were remodeled. The new tenants never learned what had once happened on those floors. Years later, when a graduate researcher revisited unsolved files for a documentary on Midwest cold cases, she came upon Rachel Lang's name. The correspondence email bounced back, address defunct. Yet attached to the researchers, inquiry reply from Milwaukee's property archive was a single digital photograph sent in error, an image logged without metadata, this time color instead of monochrome. It showed the corner of a workshop table, an analog radio partly dismantled beside a newspaper dated February 2011. In the reflection of the radio's chrome trim, blurred by motion, a pale shape leaned toward the lens, indeterminate in age, coarse in texture, as if time itself had corrupted the image. But close examination revealed something faintly familiar. The slope of the jawline, the careful haircut, the steady gaze. Professional analysis called it coincidence, a distortion artifact born of compression. Those who had read the case file weren't so certain, and in certain quiet blocks of Logan Square, where winter light still fell flat against old brick and the L cars still groaned through twilight, renters sometimes spoke of hearing radios tuning themselves from nowhere, just static fading into silence, as if someone were still listening long after everyone else had turned away. Let's start the next story for tonight. Everyone agreed the fair had been too quiet before it happened. Not peaceful, just wrong in the way spaces felt when they were waiting for something they could not explain. The rides stood ready before sunrise, lights off, metal cooling in the morning air. Music had not started yet. The first workers arrived with coffee and cigarettes, unlocking gates and raising awnings without urgency. The body was already there. It sat upright on a folding chair beneath the Ferris wheel, hands resting on its thighs, ankles crossed with almost delicate care. Someone had washed the blood from the face, but not from the clothes. The shirt was stiff with it, darkened across the chest and collar. The eyes were open. No one screamed. A groundskeeper noticed first and simply stopped walking. He stood still long enough for the scene to register, then turned around and walked back the way he came. He did not run. He did not shout. He told the first person he saw to call someone who knew what to do. By the time the police arrived, the fair was already being undone. Gates closed. Trucks turned away. Workers sent home with instructions that felt temporary, but would not be. The man in the chair was named Curtis Hale. He was 46 years old. He sold novelty knives at fairs like this one, moving state to state with the calendar, sleeping in a camper that always smelled faintly of oil and leather. People knew him by his voice more than his face. He demonstrated blades with a practiced rhythm, nicking paper, rope, apples. He made violence look neat. Curtis Hale had been stabbed. Not once. The wounds were arranged rather than scattered. 3 across the abdomen, evenly spaced. 1 high on the chest, shallow but precise. 1 deep under the rib, angled upward. The final injury was at the base of the neck, delivered carefully enough to avoid immediate collapse. He had been alive through most of it. The knife used was not found. Pinned to the front of Hale's shirt was a small paper ticket, the kind torn from a roll, edges perforated. Written on it in thick marker were 4 words. You said it was safe. No one at the fair recognized the handwriting. Hale's camper was parked where it always was, behind the food trucks, positioned for a clean exit when the weekend ended. Inside, nothing was overturned. No struggle. The bed was made. A notebook lay open on the table, filled not with schedules or inventory, but with names. Some had check marks beside them. Some had small circles. A few were crossed out entirely. At the bottom of the page was a new name, written heavier than the others. Megan. The fair never opened that day. Parents explained to children that things broke sometimes. Vendors packed up without complaint. By noon, the Ferris wheel was already being dismantled, its cars lowered and removed one by one, as if the height itself had become inappropriate. Curtis Hale remained in the chair until someone decided it was time to move him. No one rushed that decision. Whatever had happened to him did not feel unfinished. The fairgrounds were silent in daylight, which was worse than noise. Without music or crowds, the place revealed how temporary it always was. Bolts showed where rides were meant to be removed. Lines painted on asphalt led nowhere without feet to follow them. The Ferris wheel's shadow cut across the dirt in a slow arc that meant nothing now. Curtis Hale's booth was taken down last. No one planned it that way. It just happened. The table was lighter than it looked. The pegboard came apart easily. The knives were gone, packed carefully into a plastic bin by someone who did not comment on their weight. A laminated sign lay face down in the dirt where it had fallen. It showed smiling hands holding a blade flat against an apple, the cut perfect, harmless, clean. Behind the booth, a small trash bag had been missed. Inside were paper towels stiff with dried blood, folded rather than wadded. They had been used to clean something carefully, not quickly. Beneath them was a disposable poncho, transparent and torn at the collar. Someone had worn it long enough to matter, then removed it without urgency. The camper told a quieter story. Curtis Hale had not been surprised the night he died. There were no half-finished tasks inside, no signs of interruption. A pot sat clean on the stove. The sink was dry. A single chair was pulled out at the small table, as if someone had been sitting there recently, but the other chair remained tucked in. He had expected company. The notebook with the names did not read like a hit list or a plan. It read like inventory, locations beside names, short notes in the margins, words like hesitates, asks twice, alone, brings friend. Next to Megan's name was a single phrase written smaller than the rest, promised. People who knew Hale only casually remembered him as careful, almost fussy. He did not drink much. He avoided arguments. He corrected people gently when they used the wrong term for a blade or grip. He said accidents happened when people believed what they wanted to believe. That line surfaced again and again in conversations, passed along by people who had heard it once and remembered it for years. Accidents happen when people believe what they want to believe. The fair circuit carried stories the way it carried rides. Quietly, sideways, without official record. By the second night after Hale's death, People were talking not about the stabbing but about the message on the ticket. You said it was safe. Some remembered Hale saying those words to customers who hesitated before letting him demonstrate. Some remembered him saying it to children, smiling, lowering his voice, asking parents to watch closely. Some remembered him saying it in a different context entirely, behind tents and trailers, when the fair was closed and only generators were awake. Megan was not hard to find. She had worked concessions 2 summers back, then left mid-season without explanation. She was younger than Hale by more than a decade. People remembered her because she asked questions. Not about the work, but about routes, about which fairs stayed longer, about which vendors traveled alone. She had disappeared from the circuit after an argument that no one could quite describe the same way twice. When she resurfaced, it was not at a fair. It was at a hardware store 40 miles away, buying a roll of clear plastic, gloves, and a knife that was not meant for display. The cashier remembered her because she paid in cash and asked whether the blade held an edge after bone contact. The question did not trigger alarm, it simply lingered. Curtis Hale did not die because the fair was dangerous. He died because it was trusted, because it moved on schedule, because people learned where things would be and when, because it taught everyone that nothing stayed long enough for consequences to catch up. Hale had built a life inside that assumption. The chair beneath the Ferris wheel had been placed deliberately, legs even, facing the direction where crowds would have entered if the gates had opened. Someone had wanted him seen, but not interrupted. The violence was not loud, because it did not need to be. It was precise, patient, and done with the certainty that the fair would pack up and leave, as it always did. This time, it left something behind. Megan did not remember the first time Curtis Hale said it. That was the problem. The phrase blended into the fair's constant reassurance. Safe rides, safe food, safe knives if handled correctly. The language of safety floated everywhere, soothing and imprecise, a promise without a witness. She remembered the second time clearly. It was after closing, when generators hummed and the air smelled like sugar and grease gone cold. Hale had offered to show her how to balance a blade on a fingertip, not as a trick, he said, but as a way to feel where weight lived. He spoke softly, as if instruction required intimacy. He told her not to flinch. He told her that flinching caused accidents. You said it was safe. The third time, it was not about knives. Megan left the circuit because leaving felt like the only way to stop being cataloged. She had seen Hale write names in his notebook, not hidden, not guarded, just there, as if people were locations he needed to remember later. She had watched him observe who lingered, who trusted, who followed instructions without asking what they were for. She told herself she was imagining things, until she stopped imagining them and began remembering them instead. Years passed without resolution. That was the fair's gift. It did not close stories. It dissolved them. Megan built a quieter life. She learned how to be unremarkable. She learned how to stand in places without being seen. Then she saw the poster. Curtis Hale smiling, knife raised, dates and towns listed beneath his name. The fair was back, looping closer than it had in years, the same routes, the same order, the past returning not as threat, but as routine. Megan did not confront him right away. She went to the fair twice before the night had happened. She watched how Hale worked now. Slower, more confident, he still said the words. He still waited for belief to settle before proceeding. The notebook was thicker, the names more numerous, the checkmarks more frequent. The night she went to his camper, she knocked once. He opened the door as if he had been expecting her. because, in a way, he had. Recognition moved across his face and did not leave. He did not apologize. He did not deny knowing her. He said her name and gestured to the chair. They talked longer than anyone would ever know. The stabbing did not happen during an argument. It happened after agreement failed. After Hale explained himself carefully, and Megan understood that explanation was the most dangerous thing he offered. The first wound came when he reached for the notebook. By the time she dragged him beneath the Ferris wheel, he was already quiet. She washed his face because she wanted him recognizable. She placed his hands because disorder felt like mercy he did not deserve. She pinned the ticket because words had failed before, and paper lasted longer. Megan did not stay to watch the fair dismantle itself. She left before dawn, while the grounds were still holding their breath. She did not take the knife. She did not take the notebook. She did not take anything that would keep her tethered to him. The fair moved on, without knowing why it felt different this time. Curtis Hale's absence became a story, then a warning, then a rumor, with no clear ending. Vendors adjusted habits. Demonstrations shortened. Smiles became sharper, more rehearsed. Somewhere down the road, Megan slept without dreams for the first time in years. She did not feel clean. She felt finished. And for the fair, for once, that was enough to change its rhythm. The fair never explained itself. It packed and left with the same competence it always had. Bolts loosened, cables coiled, trash swept into piles that would be gone by noon. Trucks rolled out in sequence. Engines cough in a wake, routes already decided. By the time the sun cleared the tree line, there was only flattened dirt and the pale ghosts of where rides had stood. Curtis Hale's chair was the last thing removed. No one argued about it. No one hurried. Two men carried it away without speaking, careful not to look at the stain that refused to fade completely from the seat. The Ferris wheel followed, lowered and disassembled, its cars stacked like luggage. Height was the first thing to disappear. The notebook went into a box with other paper things that would not be read again. The ticket was photographed, bagged, and forgotten. The knife did not turn up. It did not need to. Everyone who mattered already knew what it could do. The fair resumed its schedule the following weekend in a different county. Lights on, music loud, the familiar lie intact. Children ran ahead of parents. Vendors called out prices. Someone demonstrated a blade on an apple and smiled as the peel fell away in one unbroken strip. No one noticed the pause before the words came, the way the demonstrator waited an extra beat before saying anything about safety. Megan did not go back. She drove until the roads stopped advertising themselves and then drove a little farther. She slept in places that did not ask for names. She learned which mornings were best for silence and which nights made room for thinking. When her hands shook, she let them. When they did not, she did not test them. She kept no souvenirs. The fair circuit told its version anyway. The story changed with each telling, trimming itself to fit the speaker. Some said Hale had been unlucky. Some said he had crossed the wrong person. A few said it was bound to happen eventually, the way things do when they balance on belief for too long. None of them said Megan's name. That was the closest thing to kindness the story offered. Years later, someone would find a folding chair at a thrift store with a stain that would not come out and decide it was not worth the effort. Someone else would tear a perforated ticket and wonder why the words felt heavier than paper should. Someone else would hear a vendor say it was safe and feel a flicker of doubt without knowing why. The fair would continue to teach its lessons quietly. Trust is efficient. Familiarity is persuasive. Belief does most of the work. And once, beneath a Ferris wheel that never went up that day, belief stopped being enough. The fair moved on. Megan did too. Nothing about it was neat, or clean, or redemptive. It was simply finished.